A Hell's Angel witnesses a waitress being humiliated in a restaurant over just $5, and his life changes. The fluorescent lights of the roadside diner hummed with a tired, persistent drone, casting a sickly yellow glow over the worn laminate countertops and the faded red vinyl booths. It was just past noon, but the atmosphere felt heavy, a stagnant blend of stale coffee, fried grease, and unspoken weariness. Outside, the sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, shimmering off the chrome of a heavily customized Harley-Davidson. Its rider, a man known only as Ghost within the local chapter of the Hells Angels, sat hunched over a chipped ceramic mug, watching the steam curl lazily from its surface. Ghost was a formidable presence. His leather vest, adorned with patches that told tales of countless miles and unspoken loyalties, stretched taut across his broad shoulders. A thick, grizzled beard, streaked with gray, framed a face etched with the lines of hard living and harder choices. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held a distant, almost melancholic gaze as he stared into his coffee, occasionally glancing around the sparsely populated diner. His presence, even in repose, was a palpable force, causing the few other patrons, a truck driver nursing a soda, an elderly couple sharing a sandwich, to keep their voices hushed and their gazes averted. They knew a Hell's Angel when they saw one, and instinct told them to give him a wide berth. He wasn't there for trouble, not today anyway. He was just passing through, a brief respite from the relentless roar of the highway, a quiet moment before the next leg of his journey. His usual order, a black coffee and a piece of apple pie, had been delivered by a young woman named Sarah. She was perhaps in her early 20s, her movements efficient but lacking the vibrant energy that youth often brought. Her uniform, a pale blue button-up shirt and a dark apron, seemed a size too big, emphasizing her slender frame. A few strands of blonde hair had escaped her ponytail, framing a face that, despite the faint circles under her eyes, held a quiet dignity. She had placed his order with a soft, "Here you go, sir," her voice barely above a whisper, and then retreated to attend to the other tables. Ghost had observed her briefly. She moved with a practiced grace born of repetitive motion, clearing plates, refilling drinks, always with a small, almost imperceptible nod or a polite, "Can I get you anything else?" Her smile, when it appeared, was fleeting, a quick upward curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. He'd seen countless waitresses like her in countless diners across the country, the silent workhorses of the service industry, often overlooked, frequently underappreciated. He usually paid them no mind, his focus typically on his own thoughts, his bike, or the road ahead. But today, something was different. A subtle shift in the diner's ambience began to draw his attention, pulling him away from his internal monologue. The source of this shift was a man who had just entered, a sharp contrast to the diner's usual clientele. He was impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored suit, his hair slicked back, and a gold watch glinting on his wrist. He carried an air of self-importance, his gaze sweeping over the room with a proprietary disdain before settling on an empty booth by the window. He didn't sit immediately, but rather paused, pulling out his phone and speaking into it with a loud, theatrical voice, completely oblivious or uncaring of the disruption he was causing. The truck driver at the counter visibly stiffened, and the elderly couple exchanged a worried glance. Even Ghost felt a flicker of annoyance at the man's boisterous intrusion into the diner's quiet hum. Sarah, ever diligent, approached the man's booth with a menu, her posture polite and ready to serve. "Welcome to Johnny's Diner, sir. Can I get you something to drink while you look over the menu?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The man barely looked up from his phone. "Just water. With lemon. And make it quick. I don't have all day." His tone was dismissive, an immediate assertion of superiority that grated on the ears. He continued his phone conversation, gesturing broadly with his free hand, occasionally making a guttural laugh that echoed unnervingly in the small space. Sarah nodded, her expression unchanged, and walked towards the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of ice water and a slice of lemon balanced on the rim. She placed it carefully on the table. "Here you go, sir." The man finally ended his call, seemingly with a flourish, and placed his phone down with a decisive thud. He took a long, exaggerated sip of the water, then grimaced. "This water is lukewarm. And where's the extra lemon? Do I have to spell everything out for you people?" His voice, though not shouting, carried an edge of condescending irritation that made Ghost clench his jaw almost imperceptibly. He watched Sarah's shoulders tighten, a subtle but telling sign of her discomfort. She quickly offered to get him fresh, colder water and more lemon, her voice apologetic. The man ordered a complicated dish, making several substitutions and demanding specific preparations, all delivered with an air of entitlement that seemed to grow with each pronouncement. Sarah meticulously wrote down every instruction, her pen scratching softly against her order pad. She didn't argue, didn't show any sign of frustration, simply listened and confirmed each detail with a polite, "Yes, sir," or, "Of course, sir." Ghost, despite himself, found his attention increasingly drawn to the interaction. He had seen bullies before, plenty of them, but there was something particularly insidious about this man's quiet, persistent humiliation of the young waitress. It was a slow drip of disrespect, designed to wear down rather than overtly confront. The food eventually arrived, and the man meticulously inspected it, poking at the vegetables, sniffing at the meat, before finally deeming it acceptable enough to eat. He ate slowly, deliberately, frequently glancing up at Sarah whenever she passed by, as if daring her to make a mistake. Ghost noticed how Sarah avoided his gaze, focusing instead on clearing other tables, her movements a little more hurried, a little less graceful than before. The tension in the diner was palpable, a silent acknowledgement among the other patrons that something unpleasant was unfolding. No one spoke up, however. The wealthy man's aura of power, however misplaced in a humble diner, was enough to keep everyone else in their seats, observing in uncomfortable silence. Finally, the man finished his meal. He pushed the plate away with a clatter that was just a little too loud, then waved Sarah over with an imperious flick of his wrist. "Check, please," he announced, his voice booming slightly now that the meal was over. Sarah approached, her small smile back in place, though it looked even more strained. She handed him the bill, her fingers brushing against his briefly. He snatched it, not looking at her, and began to scrutinize the itemized list. Ghost watched him, a slow, simmering anger beginning to churn in his gut. He knew this type. The kind of person who derived pleasure from making others feel small. The man's eyes narrowed as he scanned the bill, his lips pursed in an exaggerated show of displeasure. "What is this?" he demanded, tapping a finger forcefully on one line item. "You charged me for extra sauce?" "I distinctly remember asking for more sauce, not extra." "There's a difference, young lady. One is a request for adequate service, the other is an upcharge." Sarah's face flushed a delicate shade of pink. "Sir, the menu states that any additional sides or sauces beyond a certain amount are subject to a small charge. It's just $5. Her voice was barely audible, a whisper of explanation against the man's growing bluster. $5. $5 for a dollop of sauce? This is outrageous. Are you trying to steal from me? Do you know who I am?" His voice rose, attracting the full attention of everyone in the diner. The truck driver put down his fork, the elderly couple stopped mid-conversation. All eyes were now on Sarah, who stood frozen, the bill still clutched in the man's hand. Ghost's grip tightened on his coffee mug, the ceramic groaning under the pressure. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons darting between the man, Sarah, and occasionally, him. He was a Hell's Angel. He was supposed to be impervious to such petty dramas, to merely observe the world from a detached distance. But something about the raw humiliation etched on Sarah's face, the way her shoulders hunched inwards, the tremor in her hands, struck a chord within him that he hadn't felt in years. It was a chord of injustice, of power being wielded against the powerless, and it resonated deeply within his hardened exterior. "It's just the policy, sir," Sarah repeated, her voice now barely a squeak. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, for a manager, for anyone to intervene. But no one moved. The other patrons looked away, suddenly finding intense interest in their plates or the patterns on the tablecloth. The man slammed the bill onto the table, making the utensils jump. "Policy? This is highway robbery. I am not paying an extra $5 for something that should have been included in the first place. This is a scam. And frankly, your service has been subpar from the moment I walked in. You were slow, you brought me lukewarm water, and now you're trying to nickel and dime me? Unbelievable. He leaned back in the booth, a smug, triumphant look on his face, as if he had just won a major legal battle. Sarah's eyes welled up, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, but she quickly blinked it away, trying to maintain her composure. Her lip trembled slightly. Sir, I can ask my manager, but I assure you, it's standard procedure. No, you won't ask your manager, the man sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You'll just take it off the bill. Or better yet, I'll pay for the meal, but you can forget about a tip. In fact, consider this a lesson in customer service. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to fleece a patron. He pulled out a wad of cash, peeled off a few bills, and tossed them carelessly onto the table, nowhere near the amount on the bill, certainly not enough to cover the meal and the disputed $5. Keep the change, if there is any. And consider yourself lucky I'm even paying this much. The bills were far less than the total, even without the extra sauce. He was deliberately shortchanging her, not just on the tip, but on the meal itself, using the $5 dispute as an excuse to further assert his dominance. Sarah stared at the money, then at the man, her face a mask of disbelief and profound hurt. The silence in the diner was deafening, punctuated only by the persistent hum of the fluorescent lights. Ghost felt a primal urge to rise, to intervene, to silence the man's cruel words with a single, decisive action. His knuckles were white against the mug, his jaw locked tight. He was a man of violence, a man who had seen and committed acts that would chill most to the bone. Yet, this petty, public humiliation, this slow tearing down of a young woman's dignity over such a trivial amount, felt almost more offensive than a physical brawl. It was a violation of a different kind, a psychological assault that left deeper scars. He watched Sarah, her eyes now wide with a mixture of fear and shame, her breath catching in her throat. She looked utterly defeated, her shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the inadequate pile of money on the table. The man, meanwhile, was already gathering his things, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips, clearly enjoying the spectacle he had created. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and cast a final, contemptuous look at Sarah before turning to leave. As he walked past Ghost's booth, he paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes briefly meeting Ghost's. There was a flicker of arrogant challenge in the man's gaze, as if daring the formidable biker to do something. Ghost, however, remained still, his face a stone mask, his eyes unreadable. The man, satisfied that he had cowed everyone in the room, continued towards the exit, his expensive shoes clicking loudly on the tiled floor. Sarah remained rooted to the spot, her eyes still on the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. The sound of the diner door closing with a gentle thud seemed to release a collective breath from the other patrons. The elderly couple quickly paid their bill and hurried out, avoiding eye contact. The truck driver shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust on his face, but he too remained silent. The weight of the moment settled heavily on Sarah, who finally reached out a trembling hand to gather the insufficient payment, her movements slow and hesitant. It wasn't just the $5, Ghost realized. It was the principle, the blatant disrespect, the public shaming. It was the knowledge that she would likely have to make up the difference herself, or face the wrath of her manager. He watched her walk slowly towards the counter, her head bowed, her entire posture radiating a profound sense of humiliation. She placed the money on the register, her fingers fumbling slightly as she counted it, the amount clearly less than what was owed. A wave of something he hadn't felt in a very long time washed over Ghost, not just anger, but a deep, unsettling empathy. He had seen people suffer, had even caused suffering, but it had always been in the context of his world, a brutal, unforgiving reality where strength dictated survival. This was different. This was an innocent, hard-working young woman being systematically broken down by an arrogant bully over a paltry sum, in plain sight, with everyone too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. And he, Ghost, the feared Hell's Angel, had sat there and watched it happen. A bitter taste filled his mouth, a mixture of shame and a dawning, uncomfortable realization. His life, he knew, was about to take an unexpected turn. He watched as Sarah leaned against the counter, pressing her hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. He felt a profound shift within him, a tectonic plate moving deep beneath his hardened exterior. The world, which he had always viewed through a lens of cynical detachment, suddenly appeared in stark, uncomfortable clarity. The injustice, the blatant cruelty, the sheer vulnerability of someone like Sarah, it all hit him with the force of a physical blow. He slowly, deliberately, reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic, something he hadn't touched in years. He pulled out a thick wad of bills, far more than the measly $5, far more than the entire cost of the man's meal. His eyes, usually cold and unyielding, now held a new, intense light. He knew, with an absolute certainty that resonated deep in his bones, that he could not, would not, let this stand. Not anymore. Ghost's chair scraped loudly against the linoleum as he pushed himself up, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent diner. Every head snapped towards him, a collective intake of breath palpable in the air. Sarah, still hunched over the counter, flinched, her shaking shoulders tightening further. He was a mountain of a man, his leather vest creaking with his movement, the weight of his presence now fully focused. He walked towards the counter with a slow, deliberate stride, each heavy bootfall a punctuation mark in the oppressive silence. His gaze, usually a fortress of indifference, was now sharp, piercing, and fixed entirely on Sarah. She didn't dare look up, her blonde hair falling forward to shield her face, her body language screaming vulnerability. He stopped directly in front of her, casting a long shadow over her slender frame. The thick wad of bills was still clutched in his hand, a stark contrast to the paltry sum the arrogant man had left. He extended his arm, placing the money gently on the counter, right next to the insufficient payment. It was a stack of hundreds, far more than the meal, far more than the $5, far more than anything she would have expected. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, surprisingly soft yet carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the lingering tension. "This should cover it," he said, his eyes still fixed on her, "and then some." Sarah slowly raised her head, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears, meeting his gaze. There was a flicker of fear, then confusion, then a dawning, fragile hope in their depths. She looked at the money, then back at him, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. The sheer unexpectedness of the gesture had rendered her speechless, momentarily overriding the raw humiliation she had just endured. Her mind, still reeling from the previous encounter, struggled to process this sudden, radical shift in the diner's dynamic. The truck driver, who had been watching with a mix of anger and resignation, now straightened in his seat, a flicker of surprise and grudging respect crossing his weathered face. Even the elderly couple, who had been making a hasty exit, paused by the door, their faces a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Ghost ignored them all. His world had narrowed to Sarah and the quiet injustice that had just transpired. "You don't have to," Sarah finally managed, her voice a barely audible whisper, her hand hovering uncertainly over the money. I can't." Ghost's expression remained unyielding, but a hint of something softer, almost paternal, entered his eyes. "Yes, you can," he responded, his voice still low, now carrying a note of quiet command. "Consider it a lesson. Not for you, but for that piece of trash that just walked out. Some people need to be taught a thing or two about respect." He paused, then added, his gaze sweeping briefly over the empty booth the man had occupied, "and some people need to learn not to let others walk all over them for $5 damn." His words, though directed at the absent bully, were clearly meant for Sarah, an unspoken encouragement to reclaim her dignity. A faint blush crept up her neck, but this time it wasn't from shame, it was from a mixture of surprise, relief, and a burgeoning sense of empowerment. She looked at the money again, then back at Ghost, a tentative, genuine smile finally gracing her lips, reaching her eyes this time. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. "Thank you so much, sir." She reached out, her fingers brushing the crisp bills, a silent acknowledgement of the unexpected kindness. Just as she began to gather the money, the swinging kitchen door burst open, and a portly man in a stained white apron, his face red and flustered, emerged. This was Frank, the diner's owner and manager, who had clearly been alerted to the commotion. He took in the scene, Ghost, the Hell's Angel, standing menacingly at the counter, Sarah looking tearful but now with a strange mix of relief, and the large sum of money. His eyes widened, instantly jumping to the worst possible conclusion. "What's going on here, Sarah?" Frank demanded, his voice a nervous squeak, his gaze darting fearfully between Ghost and his trembling waitress. "Is everything all right? Did that man cause trouble? Sir, is there a problem?" He addressed Ghost, but his tone was laced with an unmistakable plea to avoid a confrontation. The last thing he needed was a Hell's Angel causing a scene in his diner. Ghost turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Frank. The manager visibly swallowed, taking a half-step back. "No problem, old man," Ghost said, his voice now a little sharper, a little more Hell's Angel. "Just correcting a mistake. Your waitress was shortchanged. I covered it." He gestured vaguely at the money Sarah was now carefully counting. Frank peered at the bills, his eyes nearly popping out of his head. "Good heavens! That's far more than the bill," he stammered, his confusion warring with his relief. "Sarah, what happened?" Sarah, emboldened by Ghost's presence, took a deep breath. "The man who just left, Frank, he refused to pay the $5 charge for extra sauce. He made a huge scene, called me a thief, and then he shortchanged me on the entire meal, saying it was a lesson. Her voice was still quiet, but it held a newfound firmness, a defiance that hadn't been there moments before. "This gentleman," she nodded towards Ghost, "he covered the difference, and more." Frank's face went from red to purple. "He did what?" he sputtered, looking horrified. "That scoundrel. I knew he was trouble the moment he walked in here, with his fancy suit and his big talk. To humiliate you like that, Sarah, and over $5. And then to shortchange us." He wrung his hands, his anger at the absent customer clearly outweighing his fear of Ghost for a moment. "This is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable." Ghost watched Frank's indignation with a detached interest. It was good to see the manager finally show some backbone, even if it was belated. But his attention was still primarily on Sarah. He saw the subtle shift in her posture, the slight lift of her chin. The humiliation hadn't vanished entirely, but it had been mitigated, replaced by a nascent pride. "So, what are you going to do about it, Frank?" Ghost asked, his voice low and challenging. He wasn't just asking about the money, he was probing deeper, testing the manager's resolve, and perhaps, his own. This wasn't just about a $5 dispute anymore. It was about the systemic disrespect, the casual cruelty that people like Sarah endured daily. It was about the silence of bystanders, a silence he himself had been guilty of moments ago. Frank stammered, caught off guard. "Do? Well, I suppose I could call the police," he offered weakly, knowing full well that for a $5 dispute and a shortchanged bill, the police would do little more than file a report, if that. "Or I could put up a sign, ban him from the diner," he added, puffing out his chest a little, though his eyes still darted nervously. Ghost let out a soft, almost imperceptible scoff. "You know that won't do anything," he stated flatly. "That kind of man, he thrives on making people feel small. He won't care about a sign. He won't care about a police report. He'll just move on to the next diner, the next waitress, the next easy target." He paused, his gaze hardening, his eyes now reflecting a deep-seated contempt for the kind of entitled arrogance he had just witnessed. Someone needs to teach him a real lesson. Sarah, who had been sorting the money, looked up sharply at Ghost's words, a flicker of apprehension returning to her eyes. Frank also looked alarmed. The implications of Ghost's statement were clear, and far more sinister than a mere police report. "Sir, with all due respect," Frank began, his voice trembling, "we don't want any trouble. It's just a diner. We can let it go. Sarah has been compensated, and that's what matters." He was desperate to de-escalate, to prevent the situation from spiraling into something truly dangerous. He knew the reputation of men like Ghost. Ghost's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing in their depths. "Let it go," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Is that what you call it, Frank? Letting a bully get away with humiliating one of your employees, stealing from your establishment, and walking away scot-free? Is that your policy?" His words were a direct challenge, not just to Frank, but to the entire passive culture that allowed such abuses to flourish. Sarah, despite her fear, felt a strange surge of warmth towards Ghost. No one had ever stood up for her like this, not really. Not with such conviction, such raw, unyielding anger at the injustice. She had always been told to just let it go, to not make a fuss, to keep the customer happy no matter how abusive they were. But Ghost's defiance resonated with a part of her she hadn't known existed. "No, sir, of course not," Frank stammered, his face paling. "But what else can we do? He's gone. We don't even know his name." Ghost's lips curled into a grim, humorless smile. "Oh, I think I can find out his name," he said, his gaze drifting towards the door the man had exited, then to the parking lot outside. His eyes scanned the cracked asphalt, settling on a distinct set of tire tracks that led away from the diner. People like that, they leave a trail. They think they're invisible, untouchable. But they're not. He reached into the pocket of his vest again, pulling out a small, worn leather notebook and a pen. He quickly jotted down a few notes, his expression unreadable. Sarah watched him, a knot forming in her stomach. She was grateful for his help, profoundly so, but she also sensed a storm brewing, one that went far beyond the diner's four walls. This wasn't just about $5 or a short-changed meal anymore. This was about Ghost, the Hell's Angel, stepping into a role he hadn't played in years, perhaps ever. His life had changed, in that fluorescent-lit diner, over a simple act of cruelty. And the consequences, she suspected, were only just beginning to unfold. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to take on a new, ominous quality, a prelude to the unknown path Ghost was now determined to walk. He tucked the notebook away, his gaze returning to Sarah, a silent promise in his piercing eyes that this injustice would not go unanswered. The thought of what he might do sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of dread and a strange, exhilarating hope. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to take on a new, ominous quality, a prelude to the unknown path Ghost was now determined to walk. He tucked the notebook away, his gaze returning to Sarah, a silent promise in his piercing eyes that this injustice would not go unanswered. The thought of what he might do sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of dread and a strange, exhilarating hope. Ghost didn't linger. He gave Sarah one last, meaningful look, a look that conveyed more than mere words. Then, with a nod that was both a farewell and a silent vow, he turned and left the diner. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving Sarah, Frank, and the other patrons in a stunned silence, the air still thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. Out in the blistering sun, Ghost didn't head straight for his bike. He walked to the edge of the parking lot, his eyes scanning the tracks, memorizing the unique tread pattern of the expensive tires. He was a man who noticed details, whose survival often depended on them. The arrogant man's car was a luxury sedan, likely a European model, and its distinct tires would be a calling card. Back inside, Sarah finally found her voice. "Frank, I don't know what to say." She looked at the stack of hundreds on the counter, a fortune to her. Frank, still reeling, exhaled loudly. "Well, I do, Sarah. That man was a scoundrel. And this Hell's Angel, he's something else." He looked at the money, then at Sarah. "Keep it, Sarah. Every single dollar. Consider it compensation for the humiliation, and a bonus for putting up with that monster. And the diner will cover the short change from the meal." He knew he couldn't keep the money Ghost had left, not with the look in the biker's eyes. More importantly, he knew Sarah deserved it. The incident had shaken him too, reminding him of his own responsibility. Sarah's eyes welled up again, but this time they were tears of profound relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Frank," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She had never expected such kindness, not from a stranger, and certainly not from her often frugal boss. The weight of worry, the constant anxiety about making ends meet, lifted a fraction. She looked out the window, but Ghost was already gone, only the shimmering heat haze above the asphalt remained. Meanwhile, Ghost was already on the move. He mounted his Harley, the powerful engine roaring to life with a familiar, comforting growl. He pulled out his phone, a secure, encrypted device he used only for chapter business. He made a call, his voice low and guttural. "Tiger. I need a plate traced. White European sedan, specific tire tread. High-end. And I need everything you can dig up on the owner. Everything. His name, his business, his habits, his weaknesses. Fast." Tiger was the chapter's resident tech expert, a quiet man with a knack for digital forensics and information gathering. Within the Hells Angels, information was power, and their network was vast, reaching far beyond the law's conventional grasp. Within hours, Ghost had a name, Reginald "Reggie" Thorne. A moderately successful real estate developer, known for cutting corners, exploiting loopholes, and a penchant for public displays of wealth and disdain for those he considered beneath him. He owned several properties, a couple of mid-tier businesses, and was deeply invested in a new, controversial development project that had drawn the ire of local environmental groups. His arrogance was legendary in certain circles, but his power was just enough to intimidate most local officials and small business owners. Ghost spent the next 2 days meticulously studying Reggie Thorne. He didn't want a simple brawl. That would be too easy, too predictable, and ultimately, not a real lesson. He wanted to hit Thorne where it hurt most: his reputation, his false sense of superiority, and his meticulously crafted image. He wanted to expose the man for what he truly was, not just to a diner full of strangers, but to his entire world. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore, it was about every Sarah, every person who had been trampled by the boots of men like Thorne. It was about Ghost finding a new purpose for the formidable power he wielded. He learned about Thorne's upcoming presentation to the city council regarding his new development. It was a crucial meeting, one that would secure millions for Thorne if approved, but it was also riddled with ethical shortcuts and potential environmental damage. Ghost's plan began to form, a complex tapestry woven from information, influence, and a touch of the Hells Angels' unique brand of persuasion. The cold and metallic object Ghost had touched in his pocket was a dog tag, an old relic from his forgotten past as a Marine. He hadn't thought about it in years, but Sarah's vulnerability, her quiet dignity in the face of such blatant injustice, had stirred something deep within him, a long-dormant sense of duty and protection. He had seen comrades fall, had witnessed the weak being preyed upon, and somewhere along the line, he had chosen a path of self-preservation, a path of detachment. But no more. On the day of the city council meeting, the room was packed. Reggie Thorne, impeccably dressed, stood at the podium, a smug smile on his face, ready to deliver his polished presentation. He began to speak, his voice oozing confidence, when suddenly, the large projection screen behind him flickered. Instead of his architectural renderings, images began to flash across the screen, grainy photos of dilapidated properties Thorne owned but neglected, screenshots of scathing online reviews from former employees detailing abusive treatment, and then, a series of doctored images. These images showed Thorne at the diner, not just shortchanging Sarah, but with exaggerated, almost cartoonish, expressions of greed and contempt, next to a blown-up image of a $5 bill. The captions beneath them read, "Reggie Thorne, a man who will steal $5 from a waitress, but expects millions from your city." And then, a video clip, subtly manipulated but undeniably Thorne's voice, discussing how he planned to cut corners on environmental regulations, laughing about idiot tree huggers. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, quickly escalating into gasps and shouts. Thorne's face went from confident to crimson, then ashen. He stammered, trying to regain control, but the images kept coming, each one carefully curated to expose his hypocrisy and avarice. A small, anonymous website link was projected on the screen, detailing irrefutable evidence of his shady dealings, leaked financial documents, and testimonials from people he had wronged. The information, expertly compiled by Tiger and strategically released, was devastating. The environmental groups, who had been struggling to gain traction, now had undeniable ammunition. The meeting descended into chaos. The city council members, their faces grim, immediately postponed the vote and announced a full investigation into Thorne's business practices. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust into his face as he stumbled out of the building, his suit rumpled, his slicked-back hair falling into his eyes. His carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him, not with a bang, but with 1,000 tiny cuts of public humiliation and professional ruin. Ghost, watching from a distance, hidden in plain sight among the crowd, felt a grim satisfaction. The lesson had been delivered. It wasn't violence, but it was far more effective. Thorne's arrogance had been his undoing. Days later, Ghost found himself back at Johnny's diner. The fluorescent lights still hummed, but the atmosphere felt lighter, almost hopeful. Sarah greeted him with a genuine, beaming smile, her eyes no longer shadowed by weariness. She was wearing a new uniform, one that fit perfectly, and her blonde hair was neatly tied back. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I heard about what happened to Mr. Thorne." "Thank you." There was no need to elaborate. The news had spread like wildfire, a cautionary tale for local bullies. Ghost merely nodded. "You deserve better, kid." "I think I'm going to go back to school," Sarah told him, her eyes bright. "With the money you gave me, and Frank's help, I can finally do it. I want to study nursing." She was taking control of her life, empowered by the unexpected turn of events. Frank, bustling from the kitchen, clapped Ghost on the shoulder. "Heard you cleared up that Reggie Thorne situation, sir. Things have been quieter around here. And busier, oddly enough. People are talking." He smiled, a genuine, grateful smile. He had learned his lesson too. He was more vigilant now, quicker to stand up for his staff. Ghost ordered his usual black coffee and apple pie. As he sat there, watching Sarah move with a renewed spring in her step, a profound sense of peace settled over him. His life as a Hell's Angel would continue, the roar of the highway, the loyalty to his brothers. But something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer just a detached observer, a man hardened by years of living on the fringes. He had found a new direction, a new purpose that resonated with the forgotten Marine within him. He wouldn't seek out every injustice, but when he saw the powerful preying on the powerless, he knew he couldn't stand by. He would use his resources, his network, his unique position, not for personal gain or retribution, but to balance the scales, to deliver lessons that went beyond brute force. The $5, the arrogant man, Sarah's tears, they had forged a new path for Ghost, a path where the Hell's Angel became an unlikely arbiter of a different kind of justice, a silent protector in a world that often forgot its most vulnerable. As he took a sip of his coffee, he felt the familiar weight of the dog tag against his chest, a subtle reminder of the man he once was, and the man he was becoming. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ghost felt a sense of clarity, a quiet determination to ride towards a new horizon.